Good morning, everyone. Would really like to welcome you to the 36th annual ARCOM conference, first virtual conference online, and it'll take us a little while to get familiar with the online environment. Please use the chat facility, you should, most of you should be muted at the moment, but if you're not, then other than the presenters, can you mute yourself? But great to have you here, and we will see your faces shortly. We can't see you all at the moment, but we can see who's in the room. So brilliant to have everybody, and just fabulous that we're able to do this through the online environment. Straight away, I'm going to hand over to our incoming chair, Lloyd Scott. I'd just like to thank, before I do, Lloyd, Chris, Nielsen and Kath for doing so much sterling work to get us into this environment. It's been an immense amount of work for the change between Glasgow and here. But without further ado, I'll hand you over to our new chair, Lloyd Scott. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good morning, ARCOM delegates. I'm so delighted today has come. As Chris mentioned, there has been a huge amount of preparation behind the scenes. I suppose, you know, this pandemic has caused us to actually meet virtually. And I suppose one of the thoughts that I have is that we are together at a distance. And I think while that may be the case, we're really looking forward to what will be an excellent conference. The virtual conference is a strong testament to the fact that there is strength and commitment within the ARCOM community, and that we can come together today virtually to actually advance construction management research. We have 2 days of a quite intensive activity for you. Please engage. We have 109 paper presentations, and we have 7 parallel sessions in which those papers are being presented. And within those 7 parallel sessions, we have 5 or 6 streams presenting at the same time. We have 4 workshops for you over the 2 days. We have 2 keynote plenary sessions. We have the Langford Spotlight, the award ceremony, and we have a social space where people can gather and meet and engage in social activities that is customary to ARCOM while apart. The platform itself contains a wealth of resources for us to engage with. Please collaborate. Please go to the lobby and familiarize yourself with the elements within the lobby, and then go to the reception area for information. And we have conference support in that our IT solutions provider, Kat O'Connell, is available to support you, along with Chris Nielsen, our conference secretary. So do post emails to them, or go into the conference support room if you're having any difficulties, and they will help you out. Just to mention also, we started last year the actual run at the Leeds conference. Well, this year we have a virtual run. So for those people who want to do a 5K run and post your results to Alex Coping, please do so. Again, in the resource area, there's information in relation to that. So we're hoping for a really, really great 2 days. And we have this session, we have 2 keynote speakers. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anne Bentley. Anne is the Global Board Director of Ryder Levitt Bucknell. And Ryder Levitt Bucknell are a construction, property and management consultancy firm who are operating in 40 different countries. Anne is a member of the UK Government's Construction Leadership Council, where she heads the Business Models and Supply Chains workstream. And she also recently authored the CLC's report on procuring for value. She is a chartered member of the Institute of Civil Engineers, a fellow of the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and she holds an MBA from the Henley Business School. In the academic world, Anne is a visiting professor at the Business Management, Project Management and Quantity Surveying departments at Birmingham City University, and she's a visiting lecturer at the School of Construction Management and Engineering at Reading University. She has a wealth of experience and is an advocate of diversity and social inclusion in the construction industry and career opportunities open to all sectors of society. I welcome Anne. Thank you for taking the time to actually come and present your thoughts on future cities and common good. And I'll ask Chris now to present the video.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak at your conference this morning. Over the last year, I've been doing a lot of work with construction around the value that construction projects create or indeed destroy, and how this value can be captured, measured and maximised. Value and cost are often interchanged, but they mean very different things. Value is about the benefits derived for the price that is paid. Construction is almost uniquely placed to create value and enhance the common good. Not only does the construction project itself create jobs, economic activity and social value. Recent research shows that £1 spent in construction generates £2.93 to the wider economy. But if properly designed and executed, the built asset can also promote the common good. Of course, delivering value in itself does not mean delivering the common good. And so there are some important questions to be asked and answered before there is any possibility of defining or measuring the common good or value that you are trying to create. One of the problems with cost and value is that they often accrue to different parties. For example, the cost of creating a public square may be borne by the developer, but the benefits will accrue to the general public. The cost of hiring an ex-offender is carried by the contractor, but the beneficiary is the taxpayer. However, regulation, policy, public opinion and corporate social responsibility are all shifting towards recognising that construction and built assets should be playing a bigger civic role. In order to fulfil this role, of what they are trying to achieve. These three examples show that clients have very different value drivers, but I would say that all three delivered for the common good. Canterbury Cathedral was built to be awesome in the most literal sense and has lasted for over 1,000 years. The Arley houses were quick and cheap to construct, addressed a dire post-war housing need and still provide comfortable homes today. Enhanced public realm for passers-by. What links these and many more examples is a very clear long-term client view of what they were trying to achieve and for whom they were trying to achieve. Creating value or the common good is unlikely to happen. Unfortunately, what is often missed is where the value lies. A built asset is pretty much valueless until it is complete and fulfills its purpose, and indeed much of the cost of the asset is spent on running and maintaining it, not building it in the first place. And yet, as an industry, we seem to have an almost obsessional focus on the cost of construction. To be fair, the negative effects of this short-sighted focus on capital cost is well documented, and back in 2018 the government made a policy commitment to improve the lifetime performance of assets through better procurement by embedding the procure for value approach in all public procurement. However, this is a two-sided coin, with a clear expectation from government that industry should develop a definition of value and a methodology for including this much broader definition of value into a robust procurement process. Sadly, we see that 2 years later, this value-based approach is still not widely adopted. This case below, reported only a couple of weeks ago, shows that the interpretation of the high remains the greatest of value or community benefit. But it is complicated. Even if a client has a genuine commitment to deliver good, there will be many different ways of achieving this, and there will always be constraints. This means that clients will be faced with complex choices. As part of the work leading up to the construction sector deal, I led some research into why clients are continually making cost as opposed to value-based decisions. There were lots of factors involved, but one of the main issues was that as an industry, we deal in specialisms, categories and silos, with different consultants, experts and policymakers constantly pulling in different directions, often leaving the client to make decisions based on the theme of the day or who shouts loudest, rather than properly considered whole project decisions. What clients and their advisors were very clear about was the need for balance, trade-offs, and a clear process for making value-based decisions. Which brings us to the question, should we be striving to include the common good in our construction projects? And if so, how? For my part, the answer to the former has to be yes. Not only is this recognised in government policy, but it is also common sense. The answer to the second part is more complicated, but I'm absolutely convinced that we can get much closer to this sweet spot and so enable clients to make meaningful value-based decisions and trade-offs. The delivery of the objectives set out in the construction sector deal has passed to the Construction Innovation Hub. The Hub is funded by government through the Transforming Construction Challenge Fund and has 4 key themes, value being one of them. Under the auspices of the Hub, a cross-industry group of over 200 clients, practitioners, academics and representative bodies has come together to develop a toolkit which will take clients and their stakeholders and advisors on a value journey. It will help them to define the outcomes that they are seeking to achieve with their project and so define the value that they want to achieve. It will guide them through the selection of a delivery model and a commercial strategy which will maximise the likelihood of those value drivers being fulfilled, and it will give a baseline against which value can be forecast and measured. But will this achieve anything? Will this methodology simply replace one set of standards, metrics and tick boxes with another without any perceptible increase in value or common good? Of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and that will not be demonstrated for some years to come. But I am optimistic. There is nothing wrong with metrics, so long as they are understood and used appropriately. If you feel ill, taking your temperature, oxygen level and blood pressure are useful assessment tools, whereas telling 49.99% of the population that they are below average intelligence is of little or no benefit to anyone. The toolkit does not set out to tell clients what should be done, but lets them see what could be achieved using a value-based decision-making process. Although amongst the contributors to the toolkit there are some very serious advocates for social value, environmental improvement and overall quality of built assets, the toolkit itself is agnostic, giving clients a robust framework on which they can hang their decisions, desired outcomes and value drivers. The toolkit does start with the assumption that value can be defined, but also that it is fluid and that value can be created and destroyed. Rather than starting with a blank sheet of paper, we've built on a model, the capitals model, which is already established and used by many PLCs as a performance reporting framework. Whilst the capitals model may not be overly familiar to a construction audience, it is familiar to a corporate audience, where many construction-related decisions are made, and it fits in very well with HM Treasury's Green Book, against which public sector investment decisions are made. But what I am advocating is a process and a way of behaving. The toolkit, and I'm sure that similar ones already exist, is only as good as the people who use it. There is no magic metric or heaven help us algorithm, but there is a well-established methodology of engagement, decision-making, evaluation and improvement. the sort of methodology that construction has been talking about for well over 30 years, and the sort of methodology that we already see used in many major infrastructure projects. What is new, or at least more recently enabled, is the ability to capture this in a digital platform, to input benchmarks and historical data, to enable clients to see what has and hasn't worked in the past, to collate policy, best practice and outcome ambitions in a single place, and to enable clients to have the best chance of achieving their desired outcomes. The trick, if there is one, is to differentiate between what is important, which is identified with the relative weightings, and what is a minimum acceptable standard. Far too often we see decisions made on important issues using almost irrelevant data. A recent and very real example of this is a tender which came across the desk at RLB. One of the questions was about competence to actually carry out the task, and one of the questions was about corporate social value. Not their ability to add social value to the asset, but the corporate social value approach of the supplier. These two questions were weighted the same, which meant that a barely competent supplier with an excellent social value policy, which almost certainly won't be checked as the project progresses, was appointed ahead of a highly competent supplier with an average social value policy. How could this possibly deliver the client's ultimate project objectives was beyond me. By combining the weighting and acceptable baseline scores into an index, an OJU or its successor compliant procurement process can then be established. This means that suppliers can be appointed on the basis of the overall value that they will add to the project or asset, not simply the cheapest supplier that can achieve the legal minimum standards, or even worse, the one that makes the biggest mistake in their tender. So, is this a utopian dream where clients and wider society will be able to articulate what good looks like, will be able to define it in a way that it can be assessed and compared, and where meaningful trade-offs and decisions can be made, and where suppliers, both designers and contractors, rise to the value challenge rather than using it as a cynical gaming mechanism? I'm hopeful that things are changing and that the pace of change is quickening. The global coronavirus pandemic is a terrible thing, destroying lives and livelihoods in its wake. But, like many terrible things, it has also brought people together, and this is very true in the UK construction industry. The COC convened task force, supported by BAYS, has published an industry recovery plan which looks at all sectors of the industry. The restart phase is pretty much delivered, and the reset phase is underway. But the most exciting phase is to take the opportunity to build back better. The reinvent phase, which kicks in next year, is about transformation, value and partnership, three key components of resilience, common good and sustainability. This has the weight of both government and industry behind it, and it is now in all of our hands to make sure we don't waste this unprecedented opportunity. I hope that you find the conference engaging, challenging and informative, and I'm now available to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. A really thought-provoking presentation. And at this point, what we'll do is we'll move on with the next keynote presentation. And if the audience actually want to pose questions, they can pose them in the chat. Then following Alex's presentation, we can move to a discussion, a session that will last about 20 to 25 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Alex Apoko. Alex is currently Associate Professor at the Bartlett School of Construction Project Management and at the University College London. Alex and I go back a long way. I first met Alex back in 2008 when we were both PhD students at the University of Salford. And we both actually did our research under the same supervisor who then was Professor Chris Fortune Chris Fortune and Chris Fortune actually was a stalwart of ARCOM, and hence we got a love for ARCOM ourselves. Alex's research interest and expertise is in the area of sustainable built environments. His current research is focusing particularly on the link between the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN and the built environment. As I mentioned, he's a strong advocate of ARCOM and is a member of the ARCOM committee. And he has been contributing to the committee for the last 4 years. And I'm delighted to say that we can finally give him an opportunity to actually do a keynote at our ARCOM conference. And he's looking at future cities and the world we want, the role of cities in achieving sustainable development goals in the global south. So Chris, if you could actually load and play the video, that's great.
Hi, my name is Alex Opoku from UCL, and I'll be talking about the role of cities in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in the Global South. 50% of the world population live in cities, accounting for about 70% of the global CO2 emission and consuming more than 66% of the world's energy. Again, it's estimated that 2/3 of the projected world population of 6.5 billion people will be living in urban centers by 2050, and out of this number, 3 billion of them will be living in city slums by the same period. It's therefore important that future cities should be supporting the urban poor or slum dwellers if city can play its role towards the realization of the SDGs. A recent report from the Red Cross indicated that about 1 billion people are living in slums in developing countries, and these people are vulnerable to disaster due to climate change, and as a result of congestion and poor housing. So climate change, the effect of climate change is, impacting on cities through floods, and the slum dwellers or people living in slums are being affected more than anybody else. There's a clear divide between the global north and the global south, and as we all know, the rich north and the poor south. So while cities can play a role towards the realization of the SDGs, when it comes to the global south, because of the challenges in these cities can't play its expected role, and therefore we need to address these challenges in the global south, or cities in the global south, in order for, or we need to turn these challenges into opportunities so that cities across the globe can play its role towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. So when I'm talking about the global north and the global south, I'm using a city like London as an example. Most people will be having an image like London in their minds when we are talking about the role of cities in the SDGs. Yes, all cities have got their own challenges. When we look at the impact of climate change now, we have severe winter, high temperatures during the summer. So yes, cities like London, New York is having its own challenges, but the cities can play a role easy. It's easy to implement or integrate technology like AI on the rest into a city like London, compared with most of the cities in the global south I'm talking about. So don't think so much about a city like London. Let's look into the kind of cities that I'm talking about in the global south. So a city like South Africa, Johannesburg, is having these kind of slums, and that's what I'm talking about. Poor planning, access to basic services are not available. So these are the kind of cities that we are looking at. We need to make sure that we upgrade these slums. We turn these challenges into opportunities before cities in the global south can play a role towards the realization of the SDGs. Not just cities in Africa. So what I'm saying is that it's not just in Africa that we have slums. There are cities in Asia like Mumbai where we have these slums available with poor planning, congestion, poor drainage, and all the other challenges that you can think of. And these cities will struggle to play any role towards the realization of the SDGs if we don't turn the challenges into opportunities and upgrade these slums. So the image speaks for itself. I think you could see the poor quality air quality that we could have, the poor drainage that as I've already cited. So services in these cities don't exist. Basic services don't exist in these cities, and therefore, how do these cities play any role towards the other SDGs that we are talking about? Another example of flooding in Nairobi, Kenya, as a result of effect of climate change. So you could see that if we don't provide a more sustainable drainage systems in these cities and or upgrade these slums into put proper infrastructure in there, then cities like that will not be able to play any role towards the realization. But in effect, if we look at the link between cities and the rest of the SDGs, cities has got a key role to play. It can drive the SDGs, but we need to make sure that we can turn these problems around. If we can turn these challenges into opportunities, as I put it, before cities can play any proper role. Some notable global agreements and frameworks driving sustainable cities and communities include the Paris Agreement 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals 2015, and the New Urban Agenda for Urban Transformation in 2016. Just to give you a bit background about the SDGs, which is the focus of this presentation, the SDGs were adopted in September 2015 by all the 193 UN member states. But it came into force in January 2016, and it covered a 15-year period between 2015 to 2030, or let's say January 2016 to 2030. The SDGs consist of 17 goals, 169 targets, and 231 unique indicators. However, the focus of this presentation is more about Goal 11, which looks into sustainable cities and communities. So looking into specifically at Goal 11, which is aimed at making cities and communities inclusive, safe, resilient, and more sustainable. Goal 11 consists of 10 targets and 14 indicators. So out of these 10 targets, we're looking at issues like more access to public transport. So access to public transport, like Goal 11.2. 11.1 look at housing and basic services, so the provision of housing and basic services. Urban planning look at target 11.3, whilst green and public spacing, access to green and public spacing, look at target 11.7. So these are just a few of the 10 targets as indicated on the left hand side here. So those are the 10 targets, and I'm not going to go through all the 10, but basically Goal 11 links well with a number or almost all the goals, and therefore the realization of Goal 11 could help achieve most of the other goals or towards the overall realization of the SDGs. So I'm just looking at that link between Goal 11 and the other SDGs. I've grouped them into where there's a substantial linkage or an explicit linkage. So without going through each one of them, you could see that the realization of Goal 11 could help goals like Goal 6, where we've got clean and water and sanitation. So access to water, we've got a more sustainable city, an urban city with good basic services. There's likelihood of having access to good water and therefore achieving Goal 6. In the same way to all the other zero hunger, when there's access to food and sustainable livelihood, that means achieving Goal 11 will help us achieve Goal 2. Likewise, Goal 4 look at quality education. So basic services, as Goal 11 talks about, target 11.1, basic services like education. So the provision of these or the realization of these within Goal 11 will help also, in one way or the other, achieve a number of these goals. Explicitly, these are some of the goals that could also be achieved once we achieve Goal 11. Not without going through all of them, just a few examples, but upgrading the slums, like the ones with the image we saw in South Africa, Kenya. That means there will be economic activity, and we could eliminate poverty or remove poverty from society if there's good quality air, like the image we saw with the slums in Mumbai, either from traffic, we could improve health and well-being of the people in that city. The protection or the conservation of biodiversity means that we could fight towards the realization of Goal 15, which is talk about life on land or biodiversity. So cities can impact on a number of roles, and that's why city is very, very important, and therefore cities can play this role. But the question once again is, if looking at a city like London, that image we saw, and a city like Nairobi, Mumbai, Johannesburg, do with slums there, can these cities play the same role unless we upgrade these slums, we provide these basic services? And that's where the target is. Currently, there's an issue with the concept of smart city and future cities, whether they are the same or different. I think academics are looking at a slight difference between what smart cities are and what future cities are. In literature, I think a recent study by one of my colleagues, Neve and Tolly, talked about identifying about 43 definitions of what smart cities are. So basically, smart city do consider high technological capabilities with the introduction of Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, digital twin, and the rest. Whilst a more future city concept now look at social inclusion in addition to technological capabilities. So I just felt it's important that we kind of look at this concept when we are talking about cities and the role it will play towards the realization of the SDG. Again, cities were at the forefront of the recent COVID-19 pandemics, and data from UNEP shows that 90% of COVID cases happen in cities, and this exposed deep inequalities in cities. And this is not surprising, because if you look at a city like London and a city like Nairobi and the image that we saw, you could understand why there were inequalities. And in effect, it did show that people living in these slums and informal settlements were more vulnerable because of the lack of basic services like water, sanitation, access to basic health. So while the COVID-19 we're looking at washing hands, enhance personal hygiene, observing social distancing, the 2-meter social distancing protocols, how do people living in these slums observe 2-meter protocols? So these were challenges, and therefore people living in slums were more likely to spread disease in terms of pandemics, because they all have access to communal water, communal public facilities, and therefore infection rates were spreading quicker. Again, because of most of these people living in the slums don't have regular income or stable jobs, the lockdown impacted on people in these slums or in these cities in the global south more than cities in the global north. In future, or to address this issue, future cities have to be future-proof to be able to withstand such pandemics. And there was a study by some UCL academic that showed that even pavements in London and other cities had to be retrofit to allow social distancing, because the social distancing, observed social distancing, were very challenging. And also future buildings have to meet minimum hygiene standards, such as maybe the provision of hand sanitizer or sanitizing stations in future buildings. Again, in order to reduce future pandemic risk and the fight for climate change, cities have to provide access to public green spaces. Sustainable housing or access to sustainable housing is key, improving the quality of air or air quality in cities. Again, because of the issue with all economic activity happening in cities, business models have to change to a more circular business model, support for local businesses and workers, because cities have got this role to play, and therefore for cities to play that role, it needs to offer these services or need to provide these to be able to fight any future pandemic. In a nutshell, we can conclude that cities should be at the heart of the SDGs in order to drive the sustainable development agenda, because cities are crucial in translating the high-level sustainable development vision into more practical local policies. That's what we call localizing the SDGs. So embedding these SDGs into local planning laws, incorporating them into local policies is key. Again, cities can accelerate the progress towards achieving the SDGs by creating jobs, offering better livelihood, improving social inclusion, and more importantly, cities can act as a massive agent for positive change if cities are well planned, well built, and well governed. So the core principle of leaving no one behind can only be achieved by leaving no place behind. If we leave a place behind, we are likely to leave that place with people. People live in places. So leaving no place behind will help us achieve leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Very thought-provoking and a really interesting title of your actual presentation. So thank you for sharing with that. We have a number of questions already. See them coming in. So I suppose we'll start off the session. People can pose their questions in the chat and we'll post them here. So I suppose, Anne, thank you again for being present with us today. It's delighted to have you here. I presume your microphone is switched on.
I hope you can hear me.
Absolutely, we can hear you. Yeah.
Excellent.
So a question for you, Anne, has come in. How might we account for new service manufacturing sectors needed to respond to changes as a result of COVID? Sorry,
could you repeat that again?
I can indeed. So you were looking at the social value of our sector. So I suppose this particular question is around how might we account for new services in the manufacturing sector that are needed to respond to changes as a result of COVID, for example, the environment in which we're living.
Okay, so I mean, I think that's quite an interesting question, because what we've seen, even since March, is that the construction sites that were probably least affected by coronavirus, certainly in the very early days, were the ones that had the largest amount of off-site manufacture, because obviously you needed the least people on site. You were able to socially distance more easily. You were able to really plan when the large components were being delivered to site. And so there's no doubt at all that although coronavirus is a terrible thing, one of the things that it has very much accentuated is that off-site manufacture definitely is going to be accelerated because of it. I think one of the really big questions we then have is, well, in terms of, sort of client influence, I suppose, should the clients be saying, I want X% of my construction to be manufactured off-site, or should the clients be saying, I want this built asset to perform a certain function? And they're quite different questions. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the value framework is allow clients to ask both questions. So, do clients actually want to influence the actual construction process itself and influence how much value that can create for local communities, for more distant communities, actually, if it's off-site? Or do clients want to really use their influence to actually determine the social value of the asset itself? And I think that the framework that we're setting up allows them to do both. And really allows, the whole point of the value toolkit is about looking at the project as a whole and making decisions that are to the greatest advantage of whatever the objectives the client sets. So I think we will certainly see a significant increase in offsite. I don't think that'll be just because of clients. I think it will be because of contractors as well, seeing it as a much better way of building. But the framework will allow clients to influence both, certainly.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just moving on then. So the question from one of our attendees is, when we talk about transformation, are we addressing the social divide?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, this big piece of work that I'm involved with hits sort of it dates back to actually the industrial strategy, and the UK industrial strategy was published in 2017 and was commissioned on the back of the vote to leave the EU. And I think it's fair to say that came as quite a shock, the vote to leave the EU, to many civil servants, to many people in government at the time. And the industrial strategy was seen as a way of, to coin a political phrase, and this isn't a political statement, to sort of assist in levelling up. And so that sort of dissatisfaction in many parts of the country was undoubtedly recognised as part of the industrial strategy. And so the transformational sort of agenda that the government now has undoubtedly is part of that sort of rebalancing of the economy, the north-south divide, etc. But, and it's a massive but in the context of this conference, that is very, very UK-centric. And I wouldn't necessarily say that this rebalance or levelling up will have any impact outside of the UK whatsoever. It's very much focused on what we're doing here, rather than possibly some of the wider global aspirations that we ought to have.
Okay, thank you for that. We have a question, and we're actually going to open the question to the speaker or to the participant themselves. Professor Will Hughes, would you like to pose your question?
Lloyd, I've just managed to make Craig's email live first. I'll try to find Will next.
Okay, so while we're waiting for Will to come on, maybe Craig, you direct your question to Alex, I believe.
Yeah, hi Alex.
Hi.
My question really was this issue we've always had when looking at sustainability of people trying to define it, interpreting it in very different ways, and the holy grail has always been to find a holistic way of interpreting it so that everybody understands it and we have a common approach. My real question was, to what extent do you think the SDGs are achieving that in practice amongst policymakers and also probably in practice as well?
Okay, thanks for your question. To be honest with you, with the SDGs, as it was set up from the beginning, it brings together a number of stakeholders, i.e., industry players as well as academia, NGOs. So the realization of the SDGs brings everybody on board. And the definition, like I said in my presentation about localizing the SDGs, means that what is important to one community may not be the same as what is important in maybe the global north or the global south. So the priority is based on which side you are or wherever you are. So in totality, you need to look at all the dimensions, whether it's economic, whether it's social, whether it's environmental, and it should be addressed simultaneously with all these dimensions. But more important is that which of these will be relevant, because in one industry, maybe SDG 1 will be more important and more practical than looking at SDG 11. And therefore, all the stakeholders are important, but the application or the realization means that we need to prioritize based on each community or each stakeholder, if that makes sense.
Yeah, perfectly. Thank you.
So, because you can address all the 17 goals for whether you are an organization, a private sector, or any country. So you look at, as an organization, as a local community, which of these 17 goals, or you even drill down to the targets, which of these targets are relevant, which of these are priority areas for that community, and they can address that in that sense. But if you look at the sustainable development as a concept, then we need to look at all the dimensions simultaneously. But when you link that to the SDGs, you can address all. You need to pick up which one is relevant to your operation. If you are, let's say, you are a business, so your construction business may look at one, let's say, goal 8, which look at employment creation, and therefore that will not be the same priority for another company looking at goal 13 or their operations impact on goal 13, which is on climate change, more than another. I don't know if that helps.
Does that help, Craig?
Yep, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Since we've directed questions to Alex, May Shaban. May, are you there? Could you pose your question?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yeah, I can hear you, May.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for Alex. It's really interesting presentation and really provoking, but I'm wondering about
the echo.
Yeah.
There's an echo?
Yeah.
Okay, I will try to remove
That's probably other people's microphones. If you could just mute your microphone while Shay's speaking.
I think there's something wrong with my mic.
Lloyd, you muted.
Okay.
Okay, there's still echo there. May, I'll pose the question. So May's question, Alex, it relates to an upgrade that fulfills the sustainability goals and requires a large sum of investment. Is it on the agenda to look for a business model to attract local and foreign governments to invest in such upgrades?
Okay, I think there was coming in, but I think I've got the basics of the question. Should I go on, because I think it's to everyone. Okay. All right. Yes. In terms of achieving. Okay. Is it okay for me to?
Carry on, Alex.
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to investment, that's a very interesting question, because many reports from UN indicated that billions of pounds are needed to address the goals. So they are mobilizing funds from various sources, and I think there's a number of reports looking at funding the SDGs. So there are various business models in terms of funding the SDGs, and that's why I'm saying that there are World Bank reports and UN reports indicate that it's, I think, even addressing the infrastructure deficit in the global south alone is talking about, I think, if I'm not wrong, about $89 billion is needed to even address infrastructure deficit, just to address one goal, which is goal 9 alone. So in terms of business model, yes, various reports, various experts are putting together funding streams towards the SDGs. And one of the goals, which is looking at the partnership, is also an important goal, which is the goal 17. Goal 17 look at partnering, and that partnership goal look at partnering between the global south and the global north, in both in financial and technical terms. So the provision or the partnership agreement, by transferring technical knowledge and expertise from the global north to the global south, is part of the goal 17, which look at the partnership. So yes, when we're looking at business models, there are business models or recommendations on how we could fund the SDGs, because it depends on funding. If we don't get the right money to implement these goals? Because if you are talking about any of these goals, whether it's about education, whether it's about health, it involves providing facilities, providing infrastructure to underpin these goals, and funding is key. And the World Bank, the UN have got different business models to drive the funding of these SDGs.
Thank you, Alex. I hope you're actually okay with Alex's response. We'll have now Will Hughes. If you're unmuted, would you pose your question for Anne, please?
Am I unmuted?
You are indeed.
Did you say my question for Anne?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Sure. Okay. Yeah. It's just this whole issue of value and measurement. I always get a little bit confused when we start talking about measuring value, because value seems to me to be a subjective construct. It depends upon the person who's making the observation, whereas quantification tends to be focused upon objective measures. And the whole idea of measuring value seems to me to be an oxymoron.
So, thank you, Will. Even if value is in the eye of the beholder, I still think it can be measured. I think you have to peel this back to what is the actual objective of building the asset, whatever the asset is in the first place. So, and that you must be able to quantify that objective in some way. But you always have secondary objectives as well. So the objective might be that you want to build a school to educate children, but you also want to make sure that it doesn't have a significant environmental impact. You might want to enhance social value. You might want to build it for £5 million. You might want to build it to a certain performance quality. So all of those things add to value. I mean, value has lots of different parts. And the whole point of the piece of work that we're doing is to help give clients and indeed their advisors frameworks on which they can hang their definition of value. I completely accept that the definition of value from the Department for Education is probably very different from the definition of value from a commercial office developer. But I think that both of those clients would actually be able to quantify what value means to them quite accurately. And I think that in the past, many professional advisors have just been, I would go so far as to say, quite lazy in terms of defining value simply as a performance cost for meeting a minimum compliance standard. And I don't think that is value. So I disagree. I think that many aspects of value can be defined and can be measured, but they will be different in different sectors.
Well, Will, are you happy with Anne's response to you? Have you?
No, I'm a little bit more confused now. The quantification of project variables is inevitably done for the purpose of forming contracts, and contracts are usually about inputs, and those inputs have to be objectively measured so that there's an easy judgment to make in terms of determining whether a contract has been discharged or not. That's not laziness. That's a practicality born out of commercialism. The problem with throwing in secondary goals of the kind that you mentioned and throwing all these into the same pot and come up with some kind of accurate number is incredibly confusing. I mean, if I feel strongly that your exciting new development is damaging the social fabric of my community, you're talking about increasing the accuracy of that particular, of how I value my local community. I mean, why does it matter whether it's 72.6 or I value it very strongly? I mean, putting an accurate number on it is really not the point. The point is figuring out which stakeholders are you seeking to prioritize over others. And I think the problem that links both your presentation and Alex's presentation is that the development of cities and economic development in generally are focused on the accumulation of wealth into the hands of the favoured few. And I'm not clear how we can continue to focus on accumulating the wealth of communities into the hands of the favoured few, whether we're talking about countries, cities, or individual property developers. Either the aim is to take away resources from the poor and put them into the hands of the richest, or the aim is social and economic sustainability of the many. I don't see how you can do both at once.
I mean, I don't know if that's a question or a statement, to be honest. So all our framework is doing is giving ways of articulating. And you're absolutely right. You might articulate it saying it's high or low. You don't necessarily have to say it's 76.4. We are very, very strongly encouraging clients to think about the component parts of value, and we have to have used the capitals framework, which you can map the sustainability goals completely over the capitals framework. They don't conflict at all. But what we are really, really pushing clients to understand, and by clients, this could be governments, private clients, any sort of clients, is to understand the complexity of the decision making that they are undertaking and the complexity of the outcomes that they could be influencing. And I take what you say about a contract, but I don't actually retract my points about it being laziness. I still think that very often we look at minimum standards for minimum cost rather than clients really, really taking the time and the sort of forward-looking thought processes to see what they actually could achieve for the same amount of money. And, you know, there's some brilliant clients out there, but there are also some, as you said, some clients that simply want to throw it up for the minimum cost and you know, solve the consequences, really. So I don't think that our framework in any way makes this worse. I actually think it makes it better. And, you know, yes, you can say it's a bit simplistic, but actually it's still a move in the right direction.
That's great. Thank you, Anne. Our final question goes to Paul Chan. Paul, and I think it's directed at both speakers. And I know we've just run over time, but I'm really conscious to pull this session together and allow Paul to actually ask this question.
Hello, thank you, Lloyd. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, so I think both speakers talk about the need to think about the future and to take the long-term view of value. I think it's also connected to what Will was saying. But my question is, how can we think about the long term if the political economic system drives short-term thinking? And I guess it's also an invitation to the other delegates in the conference. Are there international experiences of maybe other countries that you think that are doing much better than where we are right now? And how can we learn from those who take a longer term view?
Anne or Alex, would you like to respond?
Okay, what I would say is, yes, the reality is that most countries or most leaders will be looking at the short term because of their available resources. I mean, the best case scenario is that everybody should think about long term. So whenever it comes to SDGs or the sustainable agenda, if we just consider short term benefits, then we won't be able to get anything out of the whole concept. But because we are constrained by resources and sometimes, you know, the political agenda, as maybe Paul may have said, we are pushed, or leaders are pushed to take short-term measures because they want to see short-term gains. And sometimes these gains are not because they don't care about the future, but because of the available resources and the immediate problem. So if we're looking at the current situation with the COVID and the impact it's having on the economy and countries, people are looking at survival today before they would think about any future agenda, because yes, it would make common sense that if we are not surviving today, then how do we even think about something for the future? So the best case scenario is that we need to look at long-term benefit of whatever activities or whatever actions we are taking. But because of sometimes resource constraints, our leaders, our political leaders, are tended to look at the short-term or fixing the short-term problems and using the COVID as an example. That's not the best thing to do. But currently, every economy, every country is looking at how they can survive and move away from the current impact or the economic impact of the economy before any country will start thinking about how do we address the impact of the SDGs or the realization of the SDGs in 2030. Because if you don't fix the economy today, then there won't be the opportunity to even have the resources to look at what will happen in 10 years' time.
Thanks, Alex. Anne?
So when I started doing some work with government, a civil servant who I won't name said, what you must remember is that the primary objective of every politician is to become re-elected. And I'm not saying that in a cynical way. I mean, it's almost a statement of fact. And so why the civil servant told me this was I was presenting a paper to a committee about the future, about all the things that we should and could be doing in 5, 10, 15, 20 years' time. And that was a really, really useful message to me that actually, you know, most political terms are 4 or 5 years around the world. And so that if you're trying to do anything that will require a level of political support, it at least needs to be able to demonstrate some sort of improvement or impact within that political period. But that's not to say that governments don't think long term as well. They do, and you know, it might be the wealthier northern governments that are able to do this more easily than others. But actually, if you look at cost and cost in the construction sector or the built environment sector, we spend far more in the UK on maintaining buildings than we actually spend on building buildings. I mean, massively more, orders of magnitude more. And so actually, when you talk to, you know, budget holders, departmental heads within government, they do have a pretty good understanding, to be fair, of the long-term value of assets, not just the short-term value of assets. And particularly in the infrastructure sector, I would say in the UK, people are making fairly long-term decisions now. They're not just short-term. So, you know, yes, we have to accept we work within a political funding environment, but actually people do understand that building a better asset means that they spend less on it in the future. And, you know, that will be true of cities just as it is true of any other sort of infrastructure.
Wonderful, Anne, and thank you for bringing this session to a close. I'd like to thank yourself and Alex for spending the time preparing and sharing with us your position in relation to the topic under discussion today. And we really appreciate your input. There are loads of questions, further questions for discussion. So I suppose thank you to those who raised the questions and got the opportunity to actually get in on the discussion. But could I ask people not to hold back in terms of engagement and discussion offline and raise those questions. And I know we had a few bugs in the system, but please bear with us as we progress through the day and get more familiar with the platform and engage with each other more solidly. So the next session is up at 10:15. So can I just draw the session to a close and thank you all for an input and all the best for the next 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.